A rock meant to break men, the island rises from the cold waters of San Francisco Bay like a mistake that refused to sink. Sharp rock, constant wind, water that never warms, even in summer. From a distance, Alcatraz looks small, almost unimpressive. Just a gray mass floating between one of America's most beautiful cities and the open Pacific Ocean. And yet, for decades, this rock inspired a very specific kind of fear. Not the fear of death, but the fear of disappearance. Alcatraz was never designed to kill people. It was designed to erase them. Before it became America's most famous prison, before the legends, before the escape stories and Hollywood myths, Alcatraz was something simpler and more unsettling. It was an idea, an experiment, a question asked by the American state when it felt its authority slipping. What do you do when ordinary punishment no longer works? What do you do when criminals laugh at courts, bribe guards, escape local jails, and turn incarceration into a temporary inconvenience rather than a consequence? The answer at the beginning of the 20th century was Alcatraz, a place where escape was not technically impossible, but psychologically unthinkable, a place where isolation did most of the work, a place where the punishment was not violence, but silence, routine, and the slow, grinding pressure of being forgotten. But Alcatraz was never just about criminals. Like all extreme institutions, it revealed far more about the people who built it than the people who were sent there. This is the dark story of America's most famous prison. Not the legend, not the myth, but the system behind it, and the cost it demanded from everyone involved. Long before the first prisoner arrived, the rock already had a reputation. In 1775, Spanish explorer Juan Manuel de Ayala sailed into San Francisco Bay and named the island La Isla de los Alcatrazes, the island of the pelicans. It was barren, wind-beaten, and largely useless. No fresh water, no soil worth farming, no shelter from the elements. For decades, it remained ignored. But isolation has a way of attracting governments. By the mid-1800s, as the United States expanded westward and San Francisco exploded during the gold rush, the military began to see value in what nature had made hostile. Alcatraz became a fort, then a military prison, a place to hold deserters, disobedient soldiers, and inconvenient men far from public view. It worked too well. Isolation proved effective, and effective tools rarely stay limited to their original purpose. By the early 20th century, America faced a new problem: organized crime, prohibition, gangsters who treated local jails as short-term setbacks. Men like Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, and Robert Stroud. Criminals whose names carried weight, whose money bought loyalty, whose presence corrupted ordinary prisons from the inside. The system needed a symbol, not a reform, not rehabilitation, a warning. Alcatraz was chosen not because it was the strongest prison in America, but because it was the loneliest, cold water on all sides, strong currents, fog that erased the horizon. Sharks, though largely irrelevant biologically, played an important psychological role. Whether or not they posed real danger hardly mattered. Fear rarely depends on accuracy. In 1934, Alcatraz officially became a federal penitentiary. Its purpose was simple and brutal in its clarity: send the men no other prison could control. At first glance, the prison looked efficient. Clean lines, order, structure. Cells arranged with mathematical precision. Guards trained not for brutality, but for consistency. Rules enforced not with rage, but with repetition. Each cell measured roughly 5 feet by 9 feet. A bed, a toilet, a small sink with cold water. Bars that never let you forget where you were. There were no torture chambers, no public executions, no spectacle of violence. The punishment was something far more subtle, monotony, days that blurred together, meals eaten in silence, limited conversation, limited movement, limited hope. From sunrise to lights out, life on Alcatraz followed a rigid schedule. Any deviation was punished, not with beatings, but with restriction. Privileges removed, silence extended. Solitary confinement, known simply as the hole. Men learned quickly that Alcatraz did not break rules loudly. It wore them down quietly. But what made Alcatraz truly different was not what happened inside the cells. It was what happened outside them. Every night, as prisoners lay awake listening to the wind howl through steel corridors, they could hear something that made sleep difficult. Music, laughter, the distant sounds of life continuing. San Francisco sat less than 2 miles away, close enough to see lights, close enough to hear echoes of freedom drifting across the water, close enough to feel that escape, real life, warmth, and human connection existed, just out of reach. This proximity was not an accident. It was part of the design. Alcatraz did not isolate men from civilization completely. It teased them with it. Psychologists would later describe this as one of the prison's most effective weapons. Hope, when placed just beyond reach, does not inspire. It corrodes. And yet, despite its reputation, Alcatraz was never meant to hold large numbers of inmates. At its peak, it housed fewer than 300 men, each one carefully selected, each one meant to serve as an example. If Alcatraz could not control you, nothing would. But systems built on symbolism often hide deeper contradictions, and Alcatraz was no exception. Because while the prison projected absolute control, it depended on something far more fragile: human labor. Behind the bars and the legends, Alcatraz required constant maintenance. Fresh water had to be shipped in. Food had to be transported daily. Machinery needed upkeep. Cells needed cleaning. Guards needed rest. The island did not run itself. Correctional officers worked long shifts in an environment that wore on the mind as much as it did on prisoners. Isolation affected everyone. Guards lived on the island with their families. Children grew up surrounded by bars, fog, and silence, treating prison sirens as background noise to ordinary life. For them, Alcatraz was not a symbol. It was a workplace, a strange, enclosed world where duty blurred into routine, and routine slowly became normal. The system demanded emotional distance. Guards were trained not to engage, not to sympathize, not to react. Consistency mattered more than compassion. The prison's power depended on predictability. Yet predictability over time creates its own cracks, because no system built entirely on control remains untouched by the humans who operate it. And Alcatraz was about to discover that even the most isolated rock in America could not fully escape human complexity. The myth was strong, but reality was already pushing against it. The men chosen to vanish Alcatraz did not take just anyone. That distinction mattered. This was not a prison for men who stole bread, fought in bars, or made one desperate mistake. Those men stayed on the mainland. Alcatraz was reserved for inmates the system had already labeled as failures. Failures of discipline, failures of containment, failures of fear. The official language was clean and bureaucratic. Prisoners sent to Alcatraz were described as incorrigible. Men who refused to follow rules. Men who influenced others. Men whose presence disrupted order in ordinary federal prisons. But behind that language was a quieter truth. Alcatraz was where the system sent people it no longer wanted to deal with. Inmates were transferred without ceremony. No dramatic trials. No final speeches. One day they were in Leavenworth, Atlanta, or McNeil Island. The next, they were on a boat cutting through the gray water of San Francisco Bay, watching the city fade as the rock grew closer. For many, the moment the island came into view marked a psychological shift that never fully reversed. They were not arriving somewhere new. They were being removed. Among the prisoners, names mattered less than reputations. Al Capone arrived in 1934, stripped of the influence he had wielded in other prisons. On the mainland, Capone bribed guards, controlled cell blocks, and lived with relative comfort, despite his conviction. Alcatraz ended that. Here, he was simply inmate 85. No special privileges. No protection money. No audience. Capone struggled. He played banjo in the prison band, an odd detail that later softened his image in popular culture. But behind that image was a man unraveling. Syphilis, untreated for years, began to damage his mind. His once calculating intelligence dulled. He became paranoid, irritable, fragile. Alcatraz did not reform him. It exposed what was left when power disappeared. Others arrived with less notoriety but equal defiance. George Machine Gun Kelly, whose reputation for violence had been inflated by newspapers as much as by reality, discovered that fear meant nothing inside a system that refused to respond emotionally. Robert Stroud, the so-called Birdman of Alcatraz, arrived after years of violent behavior elsewhere, only to find that Alcatraz offered no birds, no experiments, no distractions. The legend would come later. The reality was isolation. Yet not every man sent to Alcatraz fit the public image of a monster. Some were repeat escape artists. Some were organizers. Some were simply difficult. Men who filed grievances. Men who challenged authority. Men who spoke too much. In a system built on control, personality itself could become a liability. Alcatraz removed context. It flattened differences. Once on the island, every inmate was subject to the same rules, the same schedule, the same silence. Individual stories disappeared behind routine. This was not accidental. Uniformity was part of the punishment. Each morning began the same way. Lights on, beds made, breakfast served in silence. Work assignments followed. Laundry, kitchen duty, maintenance. Jobs that kept the prison functioning but offered no sense of progress or purpose. Conversation was limited. Eye contact discouraged. Small infractions were recorded meticulously. A missing button, an unmade bed, speaking out of turn. Punishment escalated quietly. Loss of privileges, loss of work assignments, loss of contact. And then, if necessary, the whole. Solitary confinement at Alcatraz was not theatrical. It was procedural. Inmates sent to the hole were placed in small, dark cells with minimal light and limited food. Bread and water for days, sometimes weeks. The goal was not pain, it was erasure. Time lost meaning. Sensory deprivation did what walls and bars could not. Men talked to themselves, counted breaths, invented routines to avoid slipping into panic. Guards recorded behavior dispassionately. The system did not scream. It waited. From the outside, Alcatraz appeared calm, controlled, almost sterile. Visitors, politicians, and journalists who toured the prison remarked on its orderliness, clean floors, disciplined inmates, efficient operations. What they did not see was the accumulation. Isolation does not announce its damage, it compounds it. The prisoners were not the only ones being tested. Guards lived under similar constraints. The island did not discriminate between roles when it came to environment. Wind, fog, cold, and repetition affected everyone. Officers were trained to suppress empathy, to remain distant, to maintain authority without escalation. That distance came at a cost. Some guards became rigid, others detached. A few quietly sympathized, but learned quickly that sympathy was dangerous. Familiarity bred vulnerability. Vulnerability disrupted order. The system discouraged it. Families lived on the island. Children attended school. Wives shopped from deliveries. For them, Alcatraz was home, but home with rules, fences, and constant reminders of danger just beneath the surface. The presence of families was meant to humanize the environment. In practice, it complicated it. The island became a strange hybrid, part prison, part company town, part psychological experiment. And like all experiments, it produced results no one fully anticipated. Despite its reputation, Alcatraz was not immune to resistance. Men tested boundaries. They whispered during meals. They exchanged notes. They mapped routines. They watched guards. They studied tides and fog. Hope, though discouraged, never fully died. The very conditions designed to suppress rebellion slowly taught prisoners how the system worked. Predictability became a weakness. Routine created patterns. And patterns can be exploited. The administration knew this. That was why Alcatraz relied so heavily on its image, the myth of inevitability, the belief that escape was impossible, the idea that resistance was futile. But myths are fragile. They require constant reinforcement. And once cracks appear, they spread. The men sent to Alcatraz were not there because they lacked intelligence or will. They were there because the system believed fear would finish the job. What it underestimated was endurance, and the quiet, persistent way human beings adapt even inside cages. The rock was strong, but it was not unbreakable. Silence as a weapon at Alcatraz, nothing dramatic happened most days. And that was the point. The prison did not rely on chaos or brutality to maintain control. It relied on something far more effective: repetition, predictability, a daily rhythm so consistent that time itself seemed to lose its edges. Days began before the sun fully rose over the bay. A bell, lights, the sound of metal against metal, men standing at attention beside narrow beds, waiting for inspection. Every movement was regulated, every object accounted for, every deviation noted. The routine created an illusion of order, but beneath that order was something more corrosive, a slow erosion of identity. In ordinary life, people mark time through change. Seasons shift, roles evolve, choices accumulate. On Alcatraz, change was forbidden. One day was designed to feel exactly like the last. That sameness was not neutral. It was the punishment. Silence ruled the prison. Meals were eaten without conversation. The clatter of utensils against metal trays replaced voices. Guards moved along rows of inmates, eyes scanning for violations. A whispered comment could earn a warning. A repeated offense could lead to loss of privileges or worse. For men accustomed to asserting themselves through talk, through dominance, through storytelling, this silence was devastating. Speech is how people confirm their existence. Remove it, and the mind turns inward. Some inmates adapted by developing elaborate internal worlds. They memorized books, recited poetry in their heads, replayed memories in obsessive detail. Others cracked. Anxiety surfaced. Tempers flared. Depression settled in like fog over the bay. The prison did not respond to emotion. It absorbed it. Work assignments filled the hours but offered no sense of progress. Laundry was washed and folded endlessly. Floors were scrubbed spotless only to be dirtied again. Kitchen duties followed rigid procedures. Every task existed to maintain the institution, not to teach a skill or prepare anyone for life beyond the walls. Productivity was not the goal. Compliance was. Prisoners learned quickly that effort did not lead to reward. Only obedience did. Even privileges, access to the library, music time, occasional recreation, could be removed without explanation. Uncertainty became another tool. Men never fully knew which behavior would cross an invisible line. Rules were clear on paper, but flexible in enforcement. A guard's mood mattered, timing mattered, context mattered. This ambiguity kept inmates off balance. Control does not always require force. It often requires confusion. The whole waited quietly beneath the surface of daily life. Not every prisoner went there, but everyone thought about it. Solitary confinement was the prison's final argument. A place where sound dulled, light faded, and time became elastic. Inmates emerged changed. Some quieter, some angrier, some visibly shaken. The system treated these outcomes as success. The goal was not rehabilitation, it was deterrence. If one man broke, others would fall in line. But there was a flaw in this logic. Isolation does not only discipline, it educates. Men in the hole learned their own limits. They discovered how long they could endure hunger, darkness, and loneliness. They learned how their minds reacted under pressure. Knowledge accumulated, and knowledge is power. The guards, too, lived inside the system's psychological machinery. They were trained to remain distant, to avoid favoritism, to enforce rules without personal engagement. That detachment protected order, but it also hollowed something out. Empathy became a liability. Some guards coped by becoming mechanical, others by growing cynical, a few by quietly bending rules when they believed no one was watching. None of these responses were officially acknowledged. The system depended on the appearance of uniformity. Families on the island felt the strain in subtler ways. Children learned not to ask too many questions. Wives learned which topics were best avoided at dinner. Life continued, but under constant low-level tension. Alcatraz was not only isolating prisoners, it was isolating everyone. From the outside, the prison's reputation grew darker and more powerful. Newspapers described it as inescapable. Politicians praised its effectiveness. The public consumed stories of hardened criminals finally brought to heel. The myth strengthened. Inside, reality was more complicated. Men adapted. They observed. They tested boundaries. Silence, once imposed, became a shared language. Looks replaced words. Small gestures carried meaning. Resistance did not announce itself loudly. It learned patience. The very routines designed to suppress individuality created unintended intimacy. Inmates learned each other's habits. Guards learned prisoner patterns. Predictability bred familiarity, and familiarity is dangerous to rigid systems. Alcatraz depended on the belief that nothing could change. That escape was impossible, that the island itself enforced obedience. But water moves, fog shifts, currents pull in unexpected directions. The prison had been designed as a final answer. What it had actually created was a long, slow question. And some men were beginning to wonder if the answer was really as absolute as they had been told. When routine became a weakness, for years Alcatraz worked precisely because no one believed it could fail. That belief shaped every decision. Administrators trusted the water. Guards trusted the routine. The public trusted the myth. And myths, when repeated long enough, began to replace observation. Inside the prison, small irregularities started to appear. Not riots, not violence, nothing dramatic enough to demand attention. Just details, minor incidents recorded and forgotten. A spoon filed down and confiscated. A vent loosened and re-secured. A complaint dismissed as frustration. Each event, taken alone, meant nothing. Together they were warnings. But Alcatraz was not designed to listen for warnings. It was designed to enforce certainty. The prison's greatest strength had always been predictability. Every day followed the same structure. Every guard shift rotated on schedule. Every count happened at the same time. Every light turned on and off without exception. That predictability calmed administrators. It reassured politicians. It made the institution appear airtight. For the inmates, it did something else. It revealed patterns. Men began to notice which guards were strict and which were inattentive, which head counts were rushed, which maintenance checks were superficial, which sounds were normal and which were not. They learned when the wind was loud enough to cover noise, when fog was thick enough to limit visibility, when tides moved fastest around the island. Knowledge accumulated slowly, quietly. Alcatraz had been built on the assumption that fear would overpower curiosity, but fear does not erase curiosity. It sharpens it. Escape attempts, though rare, began to challenge the myth. Most failed quickly. Some never left the cell block. Others ended in freezing water or exhaustion. Official reports framed these attempts as proof of the prison's effectiveness. Look what happens when they try, the system said. But inside the prison, the lesson was different. They can try. The administration underestimated how powerful that realization was. Alcatraz did not need to be escapable to be vulnerable. It only needed to be imaginable. Once escape entered the realm of possibility, even faintly, the prison's psychological dominance weakened. The myth cracked. Maintenance issues compounded the problem. The prison sat in salt air day and night. Metal corroded, Concrete cracked. Paint peeled. Repairs were constant, but often rushed. Budget constraints limited upgrades. Temporary fixes became permanent solutions. Ventilation grates weakened over time. Pipes vibrated loose. Walls softened in places no one thought to inspect closely. These were not dramatic failures. They were mundane, and mundane problems are easy to overlook. The system trusted its reputation more than its infrastructure. Guards noticed changes, but struggled to name them. Inmates seemed calmer, too calm, fewer infractions, less overt resistance. On paper, discipline improved. In reality, resistance had gone underground. Silence no longer meant submission. It meant planning. The prison's rules discouraged conversation, but they could not eliminate observation. Men watched, counted seconds, measured distances with their eyes, memorized routines until they could recite them without effort. The system had taught them how to think like systems, and systems can be reverse engineered. The administration responded by tightening controls, more inspections, stricter enforcement, fewer privileges. But these responses addressed behavior, not cause. They assumed defiance. What they faced instead was patience. Alcatraz had been built to crush impulsive rebellion. It was less prepared for long-term, methodical resistance. And the men most capable of that kind of thinking were already inside. By the late 1950s, the prison was expensive to operate and increasingly out of step with evolving ideas about incarceration. Critics questioned its purpose. Reports noted its high costs compared to other facilities. Still, the myth protected it. Alcatraz was not judged by efficiency. It was judged by symbolism. Closing it would have meant admitting that the ultimate prison was not as absolute as advertised. And institutions rarely surrender symbols voluntarily. Somewhere inside Cell House B, men were quietly drawing conclusions the administration never imagined they would reach. The routines were known. The materials were weak. The guards were human. The water, while dangerous, was not unknowable. The island no longer felt infinite. It felt measurable. And once something can be measured, it can be challenged. Alcatraz had been designed as an ending. What it was becoming was a setup. The plan that should not have worked. Every system believes it understands its limits. Alcatraz believed its limits were absolute cold water, strong currents, distance, isolation. The prison trusted geography more than walls. It trusted nature to finish what steel began. But nature, unlike institutions, does not enforce certainty. It allows margins. And margins are where plans are born. By the late 1950s, Alcatraz had settled into complacency. Not because it was careless, but because it was confident. Decades had passed. The prison's reputation had hardened. Escape attempts were remembered as failures, not as data. Inside Cell House B, 3 men were quietly studying those margins. Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin. They were not the most violent inmates, not the loudest, not the most disruptive. That was precisely why they mattered. Frank Morris was known for his intelligence. His file described him as exceptionally bright. He had escaped from other institutions before, not through brute force, but through patience and planning. The Anglin brothers had grown up swimming in cold water, Michigan lakes, strong currents, unforgiving temperatures. The bay surrounding Alcatraz did not intimidate them the way it did others. The system had categorized them as manageable. That was its mistake. The plan did not begin with escape. It began with observation. Ventilation grates at the back of the cells were weaker than expected. Years of salt air and moisture had softened the concrete around them. Maintenance reports noted deterioration, but repairs were superficial. A spoon sharpened against concrete became a tool. Night after night, the men scraped carefully, patiently. Noise was masked by music hour when accordions and harmonicas filled the cell house with sound. No urgency. No rush, no mistakes. The system that punished impulsiveness rewarded discipline. Behind the cells was a narrow service corridor, unmonitored, largely forgotten. From there, pipes led upward. Then a utility shaft. Then the ceiling. Every step exploited predictability. Guards walked the same paths. Counts happened the same way. Lights dimmed on schedule. The prison was not watching for change. It was watching for disruption. The most brilliant part of the plan was also the simplest. Dummy heads. Soap, toothpaste, toilet paper. Hair collected from the barber shop floor, sculpted carefully. Painted to match skin tone. Placed under blankets in beds. At night, during flashlight checks, the guards saw what they expected to see. Men sleeping. Expectation did the rest. On the night of June 11th, 1962, the routine unfolded perfectly. Lights out. Silence. Wind moving across the bay. The men slipped through the vents. Climbed into the utility corridor. Reached the cell house ceiling. Crawled through a vent to the rooftop. From there, they descended a kitchen pipe and reached the water's edge. They carried a raft made of stolen raincoats, stitched together and sealed with heat from prison steam pipes. Improvised life vests. Tools fashioned from scraps. Nothing about the plan was accidental. It was engineered. At 11:30 p.m. they entered the water. Cold, dark, silent, the current took them. And then they vanished. Morning counts revealed the truth. Beds untouched. Dummy heads exposed. Cells empty. For the first time in Alcatraz's history, the unthinkable had happened. The prison did not know where its inmates were. Searches followed immediately. Boats scoured the bay. Helicopters circled. Coast Guard patrols expanded outward. Debris was found. Pieces of raincoat. Fragments of wood. No bodies, no proof of death. The system needed an answer. It chose the one that preserved the myth. They drowned. They had to, because the alternative was unacceptable. The official position became fixed. The men could not have survived. The water was too cold. The currents too strong. The distance too far. Case closed. But questions lingered. Sightings were reported. Family members received postcards. A Brazilian photograph surfaced years later showing two men resembling the Anglin brothers. The FBI investigated for decades. In 1979, they closed the case, concluding that the men most likely drowned. Most likely was not certainty. And certainty was what Alcatraz depended on. Whether the men survived or not ultimately mattered less than what they proved. Alcatraz was escapable, not easily, not reliably. But undeniably, the myth collapsed. The prison's power had always been psychological. Once that broke, the walls meant less. The institution could no longer be what it claimed to be. Within a year, Alcatraz closed. Officially, it was about cost, infrastructure decay, expense. Unofficially, it was about embarrassment. The ultimate prison had failed, not because it was weak, but because it trusted its own legend more than reality. What Alcatraz really was, Alcatraz closed quietly. There was no ceremony, no final prisoners marching out for cameras, no dramatic acknowledgement of failure. In March of 1963, the prison simply stopped functioning. Official explanations focused on numbers. The cost was too high. Infrastructure had deteriorated. Salt air had eaten through steel and concrete. Supplying food and fresh water to an island made no economic sense anymore. All of that was true, but it was not the real reason. Alcatraz closed because it could no longer perform its most important function. It could no longer intimidate. The escape did something no riot ever had. It broke the story. For decades, Alcatraz had survived not because it was efficient, but because people believed in it. Guards believed it was inescapable. Prisoners believed resistance was pointless. The public believed the worst men in America had finally been contained. Once that belief cracked, the prison became just another expensive, decaying institution, a rock with walls. The system had lost control of the narrative, and systems that lose narrative control rarely survive long. After the closure, Alcatraz entered a strange afterlife. The cells remained. The corridors echoed. The silence lingered. But now the island belonged to memory. Tourists came. Cameras clicked. Souvenir shops replaced guard stations. Former symbols of fear became backdrops for photographs. The prison turned into a museum, and museums are places where power goes to rest. Visitors walk through Cell House B today and hear recorded voices, stories of notorious inmates, dramatic retellings of escape attempts, carefully curated legends. What they rarely hear about is the daily grind, the boredom, the erosion of identity, the way isolation reshaped not just prisoners but guards and families too. Those details are harder to package. They don't fit neatly into myth. Alcatraz is remembered as a prison, but that is incomplete. It was an experiment in control, in isolation, in fear as policy. The question it asked was simple. Can a system break people without breaking itself? For a while, the answer seemed to be yes. Until it wasn't. The men who escaped may have drowned. They may have survived. History will probably never settle the question. But certainty was never the real issue. The real issue was this. Alcatraz failed at the one thing it was built to guarantee: finality. It was supposed to be the end of resistance, the last stop, the place where stories stopped. Instead, it became the story. And that story says something uncomfortable about power, about how institutions rely less on force than on belief, about how fear works best when it feels absolute, about how systems that appear strongest often depend on the most fragile foundations: trust, routine, assumption. Alcatraz trusted that men would fear water more than confinement. Some didn't. The prison also reveals something about memory. We remember the island because it failed. We remember the escape because it embarrassed authority. But we rarely remember the hundreds of men who didn't escape, who served their time quietly, who were erased day by day through monotony rather than violence. Failure creates legends. Endurance disappears into silence. Today, the rock still sits in the bay. Fog still rolls in. Currents still pull. The city still glows just out of reach. The walls stand, but their purpose is gone. Alcatraz no longer imprisons bodies. It imprisons ideas. Ideas about control, about punishment, about what happens when institutions confuse fear with strength. The dark story of Alcatraz is not that man escaped. It's that for decades everyone believed they couldn't. And belief, once lost, never comes back the same.